Good evening and welcome to the Pennsylvania County Board of Supervisors meeting with BZA and Planning Commission, Thursday, June 8, 2023 at 5:30 p.m. Board Meeting Room, 39 Bank Street, Southeast, Chatham, Virginia. Ms. McCluster, roll call, please.
Mr. Ingram.
Present.
Mr. Scarce.
Here.
Mr. Tucker.
Here.
Mr. Warren.
Here.
Mr. Dudley.
Present.
Mr. Dalton.
Here. Ms. Vaughn, would you do your roll call?
I sure will. I'll do the Planning Commission first. Mr. Webb. Mr. Harper. Mr. Oakes. Ms. Meese. Ms. Henderson. Mr. Brown. Mr. Waters. All right, and now is the Board of Zoning Appeals. Mr. Easley. Mr. Merricks. Ms. Deering. Mr. Craddock. Mr. Yeaman. Mr. Brumfield. And Mr. Stone.
All right, thank you, Ms. Vaughn. Moving down to item 3. Any items to be added to the agenda? All right, if none, we'll move to item 4. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Got a motion? Second?
Second.
Second. Oh, Mr. Dudley? Thank you. Any discussion? If not, gentlemen, we're ready to vote. We good, Mr. Hunt? Thank you. All right, moving to item 5, presentation. 5A, the zoning ordinance update, presented by the Berkeley Group, and contact Miss Emily Ragsdale. Welcome.
Thank you. It's loud. Good evening. Thank you all for having me here tonight to present to you an update on the county zoning ordinance update. My name is Caroline Vanterve, and I am with the Berkeley Group. Also with me again is Rebecca Cobb, and we will be providing you with a quick update on Article 7, which is use performance standards. So we are almost complete with the draft of the zoning ordinance. Tonight we'll be reviewing Article 7, use performance standards, and then after tonight's work session, we'll have one final article to draft and review together, and that will be Article 8, community design standards. So we've got that work session, and then we'll have one more work session to review the final ordinance all together, to answer any final questions or address any final changes that you might have. And then we will also have some visuals for you to review. Those will be prepared by LPDA, who we are in partnership with on this update, and they will be providing some mock-ups of development concepts, what those would look like under the newly proposed zoning ordinance. So we're almost there, on track to wrap up those work sessions in the fall and then move into the adoption phase later this year and then early next year. So Article 7 addresses use performance standards. These are included for some of the uses in the current zoning ordinance, but we have expanded them as we've proposed to add new uses into the ordinance. So the way Article 7 is structured is very similar to the structure of Article 6, which we reviewed with you all in April, categorizing standards by agricultural, residential, public and civic, commercial, industrial, and miscellaneous standards. So just as a quick refresher, use performance standards are regulation All right, take 2. So use performance standards above and beyond, typically for uses that may not be permitted through a special use permit, but would otherwise have a greater impact on neighbors. So they can regulate a number of things. They can regulate location, design, and intensity of a use, again, based on the potential impacts of that activity on the surrounding areas. And again, they apply in addition to the underlying zoning district regulations. There are a lot of advantages of having use performance standards, including ensuring uses are properly suited for an area, improving the quality of development, reducing potential conflicts between incompatible uses and properties, providing clear expectations for developers and the community when they submit applications, and then giving additional measures of direction to you all when considering use permits. So keep in mind that the Board of Zoning Appeals can also recommend additional conditions. So use performance standards are kind of the bare minimum to meet for uses that have them. And then for any of those uses that are also permitted through a special use permit, they can have additional conditions as well. So there are two types of use performance standards: area-based standards and activity-based standards. So area-based standards regulate how a use looks. They can address height, setbacks, landscaping, buffering, and then you have activity standards, which regulate the output of a use. So what's going on at the use on any given day. So activity-based standards can be standards such as hours of operation, daily vehicle visitor trips, traffic, and then restrictions on noise, odor, lighting, smoke, sanitation, food sales, and the like. And so typically any uses that would be permitted with a special use permit don't have use performance standards. There are some exceptions to the rule in cases where a use may be very large or it might have very significant impacts on the surrounding area. And again, in those cases where you have a use that's permitted through a special use permit, again, the use performance standards would be the starting point, and then additional conditions can be required by the BZA as necessary. Are there any questions in general about use standards before we move on? All right. So in drafting this article, there were three main considerations that we had. The first was making sure that any new uses that we included in the use matrix were addressed. We've drafted these standards to reflect concerns associated with these new uses, wanting to make sure they are cited and designed appropriately, and then including standards that are considered a best practice in Virginia where appropriate. Then we've also reorganized and streamlined. We've cleaned up some of the language to make it more user-friendly, easy for staff to interpret, easier for the community to understand, and then simplified existing standards where necessary. And I'll try and point that out along the way for any uses that we talk about tonight, uses that may have standards in the current ordinance, but we've tried to simplify that some for ease of administration. And then finally, during the public engagement process, we had heard a lot about use standards from staff and from the community, different uses that may be appropriate and desirable within the county, but might need some extra standards to ensure that they're complementing the surrounding neighbors and community. So that was considered as well. So we'll start with use standards for some of the agricultural uses. And tonight we're only going to highlight a few of the use standards that may be of greatest interest to you all. But that being said, if there are any other uses that you might have in mind, or use standards that you have in mind that I don't go over in the presentation, please feel free to bring those up as well. I'll stop along the way for questions or to hear any discussion from you all. If you have a concern or a change you'd like to propose, please feel free to bring that up along the way. So first, you'll recall that agritourism is a new use that we discussed at the last work session. Agritourism is required by state code to be permitted by right in agricultural districts, and so agritourism permitted by right in the A1 district. And then state code allows you to regulate generally health, safety, and welfare associated with ag tourism. So we've clarified that agritourism has to be on agricultural land with bona fide agricultural operations, so something that is incidental and directly related to an agricultural use, that's agritourism. We've proposed a 10-acre minimum, and then we have also proposed a limit to 200 visitor vehicle trips per day. That's so you don't have a large surge of constant traffic in an agricultural area impacting surrounding properties.
I have a quick question.
Go
Has
ahead.
any surveys been done? I know I have sort of like an agribusiness close to where I live. Has anyone been surveyed to find out if this will affect them negatively?
So we did a community engagement phase at the beginning of the process. We had asked for feedback from the community through a survey, through public workshops, and through focus groups. And at the focus groups, we did have representatives of the farming and agricultural community who attended and provided feedback. At the end of this process, we will bring these regulations back to the community. Those members will be asked to provide comment as to how that will potentially impact them. So they will have the chance to weigh in at that time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I'll also add, if it's a legal use currently and is established, if any of the standards that we provide would impact, not just agritourism, but anything here, if it's considered legal and conforming now, then when the new stuff is adopted, it would be considered non-conforming. It can continue as it is currently today, and not be impacted by these standards. If they go to expand or do other things, or they stop operation for 2 or more years, then they have to meet the new standards.
Ms. Ragsdale, how would this affect the amphitheater?
The one,
On Golf Club Road? I mean,
R&L Smith. So that one is actually zoned M2. It's not agritourism. So that one is actually, an amphitheater is allowed by right in that zoning district, so it would not be affected by this. We do have some wineries and things like that that do some agritourism. At one time, we had a pumpkin patch out on 640. That's considered agritourism. So it would affect businesses like that have a working farm, that supplement their farming by encouraging the community to come to their business to explore, agriculture in that way. So it would not affect the amphitheater per se.
Other examples too would include like a corn maze or pick your own, a Christmas tree farm, things such as that are directly related to an existing agricultural operation on the property. Are there any other questions related to agritourism?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. 200 vehicle trips. So that's not necessarily, like 4 people could come in a car, or you could bring a 18-passenger van. But that van could only, that would count as one trip. So that would be one regardless of how many people came in it. They would be impacted by that. So that is something that we can look at. That is something that we can look at.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
They would be considered, she's saying they would be considered existing, so they would become legal non-conforming, so they could continue operating as they are and not fall under these regulations. These would apply to any new ones. So if you don't wish to set those limits or you would like to up those limits, that is something that we can look at.
Yes, so the question was, what is considered a legal non-conforming use, and then what would allow it to be an illegal non-conforming use. So if a use ceases operations for 2 or more years, then it would have to fall under the regulations of the new ordinance, even if it was already existing. If you have a structure that expands significantly, that would be a legal non-conforming. I know I'm missing a few. Rebecca, those are the big things. But basically, if a use is existing now legally under the ordinance and it continues to operate in the same way after this new ordinance is adopted, it would be considered a legal non-conforming use. It would be allowed to continue operating as it has been.
No. So currently, under our ordinance, if you were in operation prior to the adoption of the ordinance in 91, or if we have since made ordinance changes and you were in operation prior to those changes, you are considered a legal non-conforming use. So as long as you continue to remain in operation, you don't cease operation for 2 years, you can continue as you are. Now, if you expand your operation, or say you have a structure that does not meet current setbacks, you cannot expand that structure unless you can bring it into conformance. Things like that are currently in our ordinance.
Ms. Ragsdale, personally, I have a little bit of concerns about the attendees numbers
Better get in the mic.
and the car numbers. Because let's just take someone that's owned agriculture for a long time but hasn't done an event venue or anything like that. We're gonna make him do different than one that's already in existence.
Well, yes and no. So this is where it can get kind of tricky, because if we do have event venue standards, but if they make the argument that that venue is agritourism and they can prove that they, are basically using that in conjunction with their farming, then I can't regulate them as an event venue. I have to regulate them under agritourism. If, for instance, in Atkinson Barns, that is, they cut hay on that property. Parts of that property are agricultural. However, that is an event venue, so that would be regulated differently than agritourism. Under event venues, we can place conditions on special use permits, and the building code regulations can restrict the number of people that can be in that facility. But we do not currently have any standards that regulate trips per day or number of attendees, no.
I just think we want to be careful not to create a disadvantage to new business to compete with existing business.
And in that
in all of
case,
it.
we can look at either eliminating that number, if you would like to eliminate the number of attendees, the number of vehicle trips, or both, or we can look at increasing those. That is going to be up to you all.
Would you all like us to consider eliminating one or both of those requirements, or amending them to make them less restrictive?
And I'll just add, while you consider that question, the purpose of the limitation is because it's essentially an agricultural area, so wouldn't see very much traffic. And then if someone suddenly says, okay, I've been, farming this, but now I'm going to start allowing tours and education things, you could see, a pretty big influx of traffic. And so you want to make sure that that impact is addressed, so that the neighbors aren't, hey, every Saturday there are 500 cars coming down my road and it's dangerous. So those are the types of impacts that you need to consider with that number. And so I would advise, rather than eliminating the number, you come up with a number that's more suitable to your community. At what point, if this is in your neighborhood, your neighbor is suddenly having, agritourism stuff, pick your own blueberries or whatever, what number is going to be too much and too impactful for your neighborhood? Is that, if it's not 200, is it 500? Is it, what? And so that's what we would be looking from you all, is advice on what is suitable.
I'm not upset too much or concerned about the vehicles, but I am concerned about the attendees because, not even figuring one person per return of a vehicle. So, I think that number needs to be adjusted for the attendees.
And to clarify, it's 200 visitor vehicle trips per day. The 150 is at one time. So that's, say, someone saying, I'm going to have a class today to teach everybody how to run a dairy operation, or teach everybody how to, do something. And so that would be, okay, I'm going to open this up to an event at one time. Everybody gets here at, 8 p.m., 8 a.m., we're going to start. So that's what that 150 number is everybody coming in at one time, leaving at one time for a particular education experience.
Well, it says per day, 150 or fewer per day. It doesn't say at one time, it says per day.
In the actual text, section 7-2-3,
Yeah, but the
it
attendees
says,
is 150 per day.
the event or activity shall generate no more than 200 visitor vehicle trips per day, and each event or activity shall have 150 or fewer attendees at any single time.
So that's a mistype on the PowerPoint.
Okay, so the language needs to be cleaned up.
PowerPoint. In the ordinance, it does state 200 visitor vehicle trips per day, and each event or activity shall have 150 or fewer attendees at any single time.
Okay. All right, I got a question. Emily, you can answer this. Say there's not much going on at a farm now, but there could be an event, and it could draw more than the actual numbers that we're looking at right here as far as vehicle trips or people. Then is there something that we could override or supersede that for like a special event? Would we have to get a special use to override or supersede? You see what I'm saying? That's a question that
So for the state code does not allow additional permits to allow the use.
Okay.
And that is to protect and encourage agritourism.
Sure. You see what I'm saying?
Special events would be considered separate, as a separate use from agritourism. So for example, if there were a wedding held on a farm, or a family, well, maybe not a family reunion, some sort of festival or something that is event-oriented, it is not for the purpose of educating people what happens on the farm, directly related to the farm operation, that would be considered a completely different use.
Okay.
And in that case, yes, you would have the ability to take a look at it through a special use permit and require additional conditions if needed. Does that answer your question?
It does. I just
Okay.
was thinking
This-
outside of the box a
This
little
would
bit.
just apply, say Vanderhyde Dairy decided that they were going to have a dairy education day, and they were going to invite people to come to the farm, and they were going to teach you, how milk is, how cows are milked and the process. after the milk has been collected, they could only have 150 people there at that one time for that event.
Okay.
Now, the strawberry patch, that would not apply because people are coming and going, so that is where that 200 trips would kick in. Unless they had an event relating to, they had a large group come in and they were all going to be there and pick strawberries at one time, and it was only open to that group, then it would just be capped at 150.
Okay.
If that helps clarify
It does.
the language.
Thank you. Yeah, they have events. That's an event. It's different.
And that could, flip-flop Friday, I could see that being negatively impacted by the 150 cap. So if you upped that a little bit now, I'm not sure that you would want 500 people in that facility, at one time for flip-flop Friday. But the weddings would be a special event. That would not be an agritourism use. Their fundraisers are not an agritourism use, that's a special event. So that would fall under a separate section of the code. But Flip-Flop Fridays, where they're providing the product that they make, that would potentially be negatively impacted. So I could see the need to maybe up that number if the cap is left. It is existing, so they would not, unless they tried to expand it.
That's right.
They would not be negatively affected.
And I don't want to discourage you. No.
So would the board like for the Berkeley group to look at increasing that number?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have a number that you have in mind that you think you would be comfortable with?
400 or 500.
What do you think, Richard?
Would 500 be too much?
I'd go 5.
Okay.
Less than 5, about anything.
So just to be sure that I understand, keep the 200 visitor vehicle trips per day the same, but increase the number of attendees allowed at any one given time to 500. Is that correct?
I would recommend at least do 250 on the vehicle trips, if not more, because then that's
That'd
two
be
people
two
per
per
car,
vehicle,
which is a good average. So if we're looking at 500, I would do at least 250.
Yeah.
All right, so increase the permitted vehicle trips per day to 250, and then 500 attendees at any given point in time during the day.
Yes, that'd be good.
Okay.
I'm not sure who's going to get out there and count them, but
Thank you.
here we
That's
go.
right.
Do we have an official accounter for this?
That would end up being
That would be staff.
That's Emily.
out there with my clicker.
All right, are there any other questions related to agritourism? All right, and I do have a slide for special events, and so we will talk a little bit about that later on. Oh, wrong way. So residential agriculture, I'll just say that we met with staff prior to this meeting to discuss this use and several other uses. And so what you see on this PowerPoint here will be changing partially. And so I'll try and walk you through that. And then if you have any other questions, please let me know. So residential agriculture, incidental ag, gardening, beekeeping, raising livestock that is accessory to an existing residential use. It's not part of a farm, you're not doing it for compensation. Currently, incidental ag, it's permitted by right in A1, RE, R1, RMF, and MHP. So we've proposed a 10-acre total maximum. This is tied to agritourism. If you're keeping animals on above 10 acres, you would be considered a farm that would be regulated as agriculture. Here we've proposed 1 acre per animal unit. This is something that we've proposed for animal safety and welfare to prevent overcrowding on the property. And then staff is also going to provide this section of the code to the local extension office for their review and comment as well. You'll see here that we've proposed some animal unit maximums. You'll see that there's a 4 animal unit maximum in A1. That is going to be removed. We will not keep a maximum animal unit number in A1, and then we'll also take a look at animal unit maximums in the other district as well to make sure that those are going to be complementary to the neighbors in the surrounding area. So the way this would work is you see the chart on the right-hand side of your screen, goes down the line with different animal types, and it has how many animals of that type would be considered as 1 animal unit. So for example, you see that 1 horse or 1 donkey would be 1 animal unit, but then 16 chickens would be considered the equivalent of 1 animal unit. And so this is something that the Extension Office is also going to take a look at to make sure that they are good with it, if they have any recommendations for how that should change. But being able to regulate density of animals rather than a maximum number of total animals, that just makes sure that the animals are safe, that their welfare is included, and also neighborhood safety, impact on neighbors, that there's not overcrowding of animals on a property that shouldn't have overcrowding. Also make sure that animals are being cared for properly, and that someone is not trying to keep a cow or horse inside when it needs to be on that acre. And I've got a few examples on the next few slides that will hopefully explain it better. So R1, RMF, MHP, you would have a minimum of 1 acre per animal unit, and then a maximum total of 10 acres, since there are some larger R1 properties in the county. And then again, we'll be reviewing the animal units and maximum densities more closely with staff in the Extension Office in the coming weeks. And then just in RE, so not in A1, you would have, again, that same minimum of 1 acre per animal unit, regulating the density, and then a maximum total of 10 acres. So this is an example of how staff would consider it. You have property owner A, they live in the R1 district on a ½ acre, and they'd like to raise 4 goats. So they're under the maximum acreage of 10 acres, and because they live on a ½ acre parcel, that would equal a ½ animal unit, and then they could keep up to 2½ goats. You can't have a ½ goat, so they could have 2 goats on their property. Then you have property owner B. We'll change this back to R1 since A1 won't have animal unit maximums anymore. They live in R1 on a 2 acre parcel, and they want to raise 3 goats and 16 chickens. They're under the maximum acreage, and because they have 2 acres, that would equal 2 animal units. They could have up to 5 goats and 16 chickens, assuming that those are the types of animals they would want to keep. Does that make sense? Do you all have any questions?
I just want to see how this correlates with what our current code is. I know a lot of people have multiple horses and that sort of thing. How will this impact people who have, especially R1? I know that they live in R1 and have horses and that sort of thing. Will that affect anyone with these changes? And
If they currently have horses on their property, then no. This would, what we run into as staff is we have people who live on small properties that do not have adequate acreage to provide adequate spacing for livestock, yet they keep a cow, and they live on less than an acre. They've got multiple goats, they've got multiple pigs, they've got chickens running everywhere, and their neighbors are calling us, but because they're residential and it's incidental agriculture and we don't have density requirements, and as long as they don't occupy more than 5 acres, there's not a lot that we can do as staff to regulate that. And the same thing with animal control, because they don't typically deal with livestock in those situations. There's not much that the county can do. So this would help us better regulate, especially on residential properties where your lots are smaller, you're in closer proximity to your neighbors. This would cut down on negative impacts to adjacent property owners for large amounts of livestock when that's not necessarily a use that's compatible with that zoning. And that is why we removed A1, because if you're A1, we have no interest in regulating the number of animals you have. We did have conversations about density requirements, so we don't want to see you try to put 10 cows on a half-acre lot. We have situations now where we have people keeping cows locked in buildings. If the cow is adequately fed, we know that that's inhumane for the cow because it needs to graze, but if it's not, if it's adequately fed, there's not a lot we can do about it. So this would require, help us control some density and help us better regulate that use. So, if you have horses now in R1, you still can't occupy over 5 acres, even if you own a 20-acre lot. So this actually increases that to 10 acres, and we are looking at some of those requirements specifically for horses, because a lot of times they don't need the space to graze that necessarily a cow does. Especially depending on the type of horse that it is. So they are going to go back, they're going to look at those spacing standards. We're going to have the extension office review it to help us make sure that, we are correct in what we're saying each classification of animal needs. And then hopefully, that'll be put into the ordinance so we can make sure that we're in line with industry standards.
How much more staff are you going to need?
Really, the goal of the changes here to, one, as Emily mentioned, be sure that animals are being properly taken care of, that they're being treated in a humane way, that they are safe, their welfare is ensured, and 2, to limit impacts on neighbors that might arise from noise or overcrowding or animals roaming past the property line of the owner. That's the intent of these regulations, and by proposing to take a look at it based on density and spacing and animal units, that just kind of helps ensure that that's being done fairly across the board. Any other questions?
And I will add that any changes that are made will come back to you, and we can point out when we do the final review. And so you'll be able to see what the extension office has recommended and then what it's changed to, and you can provide additional input on that at that time.
So next we have intensive agriculture, and this is an example of where we have retained just about everything from the current ordinance, but we have just reorganized and rewrote it for clarity. So if you notice that you're looking at the article and it looks really different, it's really not. We've just tried to make it user-friendly and streamline some of the content so it's clear what exactly is being required of the owner or the operator. The only thing that we have proposed to remove is a current requirement that requires any adjacent property owners who are building a new residential dwelling on property next to an existing intensive agricultural facility to adhere to setback and buffering requirements above and beyond what's required. We've proposed to remove that. It's an unfair burden on the adjacent property owner to be required to go above and beyond to buffer from an existing intensive agriculture facility. Additionally, this is the agriculture district. Agriculture is the primary use. It's the purpose of having the district. And so that just makes sure that that happens. Are there any questions about that? All right, so now we move into some examples of residential uses and use performance standards. Class A home occupations are a current use in the zoning ordinance. In this proposed ordinance, they would be permitted by right in all residential districts as well as B1 and C1. Only family members who actually live in the home would be allowed to be employees, and customers would not be allowed to come to the site. And we've also added a standard to address traffic, and then we've retained other general standards that exist currently in the ordinance. The reason why we address traffic, if they're shipping things from their property, if they've got traffic to transport any goods, just wanting to make sure that that, again, is compatible with the surrounding area, that all of a sudden there isn't this huge surge in vehicle traffic that's impacting neighbors. And so that's the purpose of adding that regulation. And then if you all would like to amend employees or customers, you all can do that. But we also have a Class B home occupation that allows for more employees and customers coming to the site.
And I will add that this is the current regulation in the ordinance. And our ordinance does state that it cannot generate additional traffic to the area. So this just better regulates that requirement. So there's really not a change in what a Class A home occupation is from the current ordinance to what's being proposed.
And then we've got Class B home occupations. And just as a reminder, this would be something like an at-home hair salon or an at-home accounting business, something where you might have more employees beyond people who are in the family, and you would have customers who are coming to your site to partake in those services. So this, like Emily said, this is existing in the current ordinance. We have retained everything that applies to Class B home occupations, and we've just reorganized it for clarity. And then just as a reminder, no more than 2 employees other than family members who already live at the dwelling unit would be allowed on site to conduct business. And then no more than 5 customers may be on the property at any one time, and they must make an appointment to visit. And then we've got some general standards included for hours of operation, exterior storage, and traffic. Again, just wanting to make sure that's clearly spelled out in the ordinance and limiting any adverse impacts on neighbors. And then again, if you all would like to amend the number of customers who might be on site at any one point in time, or the number of any non-family employees, you all, of course, have the option to do so. So you'll recall that short-term rentals are a brand new use in the ordinance. We have added it, we have given it a definition, and we've proposed to permit it by right in A1, RE, B1, and C1, and then through a special use permit only in the R1 district. So as short-term rentals are growing in popularity, it's important to make sure that they are regulated, that staff has text that they can point to in the ordinance to enforce any violations, to limit adverse impacts on neighbors. And so we've tried to do that through these use standards. So operators of short-term rentals would have to register, pay applicable taxes to the county. We've added use regulations to address noise, trash, and occupancy requirements. The structure has to meet building code, really making sure that this is safe for the occupants and that it's limiting adverse impacts on the neighbors. So your Airbnb can't be a party house that leaves its trash everywhere and is blasting music until 3 a.m. That would not be permitted. So making sure that's spelled out in the ordinance. And then after 3 substantiated violations, the administrator can revoke the permit, and then the operation would have to completely stop. So we've just clarified that this is substantiated violations. This is not just complaints. So violations that staff has gone to take a look at, determined that this is a violation of the zoning ordinance. Once that's happened 3 times, the short-term rental has to stop operating. Are there any questions about short-term rentals or the associated use standards? next we have campgrounds, and we have added some new standards for campgrounds to ensure clean and safe campgrounds for any visitors, but also just being completely clear that campgrounds are for temporary occupancy. You cannot live at a campground. You cannot park your RV somewhere, call it a campground, rent a lot at a campground long-term and live there. They're for temporary occupancy. The only person who would be permitted to live there full-time is the owner or the operator of the campground, and they would have to do so in a permanent residence, and that would be the only permanent residence permitted as part of a campground. So trying to make that completely clear to help staff be able to administer and enforce the ordinance when it comes to that particular issue. We've also added some requirements for noise, lighting, signage, and trash. Again, just making sure that the campground is clean, it's safe, it's not posing severe impacts on neighbors. The current ordinance has some individual campsite setbacks from property lines, and so we have increased those setbacks to 25 feet. So any one individual campsite would have to be set back 25 feet or more from the exterior property line, again, to make sure that uses are compatible, especially if there are any residential uses nearby, prohibiting the parking, sale, and storage of RVs. And then we've also introduced a requirement that there has to be at least 5% of open space on the campground, again, just to prevent overcrowding, to make sure it's safe, that there are places for visitors to recreate and the like. Any questions related to campgrounds? So mobile restaurants or food trucks, this is another new use in the ordinance. Food trucks are permitted by right in all districts. A lot of times you'll see them as an accessory use at a special event, or somebody will rent a food truck at their birthday party. So wanting to be sure that food trucks are permitted by right to allow that to happen, support local businesses, but you'll see that they also have an extensive set of use standards to ensure that they are not posing adverse impacts, that they're not becoming permanent restaurants on the side of the road, that people are getting their proper permitting, that they're required to have through the health department to make sure that they're operating like they should. So you'll see that we've got some noise control regulations, that if they have a speaker or some other feature that emits noise, it can't exceed 50 decibels from 100 feet away. We've introduced some hours of operation during the week, increasing those a little bit into the night over the weekend, and then adding some setback requirements as well. So requiring a minimum of 100 feet between a food truck and any existing restaurant, unless permission is otherwise given, and then at least 50 feet from any single or two family dwellings. We've also made sure that it's clear that it's required to be a licensed movable vehicle or some sort of enclosed trailer. You can see the one on the left is clearly a food truck. That would be what would be permitted as a food truck. What wouldn't be permitted is someone selling food off their truck bed without their proper permits, without adhering to the setbacks, making sure that it is a proper mobile restaurant. Are there any questions about food trucks or mobile restaurants?
That second one looks like the one we used to eat at the bike field. Eat on the back.
I just want to add one little thought about this. We were meeting with staff today, and staff pointed out that in our text, we refer to that these and some other uses have to obtain a business license from your county. And she said, we don't have a business license for the county. And so I want to just express to you all that it might be a good idea. Otherwise, we need to tweak this, take this out. But I would suggest that you consider requiring a business license from your businesses. I think, in some cases, you're using machinery and tools tax to capture those taxes because you can't do both. However, there are lots of businesses that aren't going to give you machinery and tools taxes. But there could be food tax, or there could be transient occupancy tax, like with your bed and breakfast, short-term rentals, those types of things. But they have a tendency to fly under the radar and not pay those taxes if they don't have to come to you and say, hey, I'm a business, and you collect that business license and realize that they are business. And that fee could be very small, but it would help you capture those other taxes and things that you're missing out on. So I just want to provide that to you all. If you have immediate reactions, go ahead, let us know. If you don't, it is something that we'll need to consider so that we know whether this text needs to not refer to business license, or if it's something that you're going to take on and start doing, and we'll keep it in.
I like the idea of a license, business license for a food truck or something like that.
I will say that it would help
Yeah.
my department and the fire marshal, because a lot of times we do not know that businesses are in operation.
That's right.
Or that uses change in the building, and sometimes the uses are not permitted. And so the businesses are in full operation before we find out about it, and then, we have to be the bad guy and cause them to either shut down permanently and find a new location, or do lots of modifications to the building to meet zoning and building code and fire code. Whereas if we could catch the business prior to them opening and help them through the process,
Yeah.
it would be much smoother on their end. It could be cheaper on them in the long run. And it just is really a much better process for everyone involved.
With no license, there'd be no restrictions
Well,
or
The issue is,
complications.
we're well aware about business license. The
Yeah.
issue is, we've crunched the numbers, and you can't have both a business license and machinery and tools. And we would leave significant money on the table if we got rid of machinery and tools.
Right.
Now, if we do analysis in modern days, it might be closer to breaking even. That's to be said, perhaps we should create some kind of registration process that
Yeah.
might, accomplish the same thing. But I do agree, we need to have
Yeah.
Kim do that analysis.
So would an M&T, would that be with a food truck or something, or not?
No, that's usually for
That's
larger
what I thought. Yeah,
businesses.
well, I know industry, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a different use. So that would either be under a seasonal use, or that could be under a wayside stand. So that would be completely different. This is prepared food. This is not fresh food. So this is your typical food truck that's selling hamburgers, hot dogs, that kind of thing out of the truck. They're required to be inspected by the fire marshal. They're required to have proper permitting from the health department. We need to regulate where their waste goes, because we don't want them dumping their waste into our sewer system unless they have a grease trap and it goes through a grease trap and all that is properly filtered, or we're going to have issues in the long run with our sewer system. So, and then we have issues now with them setting up permanently in one location and not moving. And a lot of times they don't always get required permits, or, they don't meet setbacks, and then we get calls about their generators running and we have to listen to the noise, and they're creating a lot of traffic, but we don't regulate them, so staff doesn't have the ability to, reduce the impacts on adjacent property owners. So this would just help us do that and ensure that they are getting all the required permits and inspections.
Mr. Hunt, you brought up that if we were going to transition to a business license and doing gross receipts, think about the nightmare that's going to be for our Commissioner of Revenue, and how many more staff members she's going to need to keep up with those businesses, to keep everybody honest. I'm just saying, we probably ought to engage some conversation with her about this before we ought to certainly look at the numbers, but
I think all they're asking is if you all are going to consider it, they'll leave it as is for the time being, and then you can let them know at a later date whether or not you need to remove it, or if you all just know without a doubt right now that that's not a direction you want to go, they can go ahead and take that out. So I think that's all they're looking for at this time.
Yes, we can leave it in for now, and then if you all decide later on down the road to go ahead and remove it, we can remove it. As Emily had mentioned earlier, we'll have a couple more work sessions throughout the process to review and keep refining as we need to. But in the context of this particular use, business license aside, staff would still have plenty of regulations to be able to make sure that food trucks are following. Again, they would be required to get their health department permits. The fire marshal would have to take a look. They can't be parked permanently. So staff would still be able to enforce any illegal food trucks. Or food trucks that are not adhering to the standards, I should say. So we have a standalone use for special event. So special events would be, agritourism would be, again, considered completely differently. Special events are events that are temporary, maybe they're one time, maybe they recur twice a year, but they're not permanent, and they would draw larger crowds. So things such as circuses, fairs, outdoor concerts, music festivals, anything that is temporary for the purposes of amusement and not directly associated with agritourism. So that would be a special event, and it would be allowed through special use permit in A1, B1, and B2 only. So with this use, this is the first example we've talked about tonight that is only permitted through special use permit. So keep in mind that special events would have to adhere to anything in the underlying zoning district that's required as far as setbacks go and any other pertinent requirements. They would have to adhere to all of the use performance standards, and they would have to adhere to any conditions that the BZA requires. So this and then the underlying zoning districts are a starting point that would apply to all special event uses, and then they may have above and beyond that as the BZA determines to be appropriate. So if there are any temporary structures associated with a special event, for example, if you have a circus that is setting up a very large tent, they would be required to obtain building permits, and then the structures would have to be taken down within 24 hours of the event's conclusion. So it just couldn't sit there forever and begin to deteriorate. It would have to be removed properly. We've included some general standards for noise, trash, lighting, and parking. And we've also required occupancy to comply with all local and state laws to prevent overcrowding on the property. And then we've also required the provision of adequate sanitary facilities in accordance with state code regulations. So again, this is special events separate from agritourism, and then we do have a use that addresses permanent event venues. So permanent event venues such as a conference center or a banquet hall, those would be regulated separately. This is really intended to address anything that is large, one-time, temporary, the likes of a festival or a fair or a circus.
And I will just add that the music festival ordinance that the county has in our current code would be in addition to this. So they would be required to get a special use permit, and then they would have to come before you all for a music festival permit. That would not eliminate that requirement.
Are there any questions? This is another one that we did, I'll go ahead and say, did discuss with staff earlier this afternoon. We're also going to take a look at adding potentially some hours of operation to make sure that the special event does not go on all through the night and is noisy and is posing impacts to neighbors. And then we're also going to take a look at some other regulations to be sure they're completely airtight. So we've introduced battery energy storage facilities as a use in the ordinance. Battery storage facilities are relatively new. They are slowly beginning to creep into Virginia. They are often cited in conjunction with utility scale solar facilities. So if utility scale solar facilities are generating excess energy, the battery energy storage facility will store that energy for release at a later date. So because they're typically cited in conjunction with utility scale solar, which the county does have a lot of, it's not unreasonable to expect that an application would be coming through in the future and wanting to be prepared with use standards in place so that if and when an application does come along, it's meeting these standards, that high quality application is being received that's already checking off some of the bare minimum boxes. So just as a reminder, battery storage facilities would only be allowed through a special use permit in A1, M1, and M2. So again, the BZA would be able to leverage additional conditions above and beyond what you're seeing in the zoning ordinance. So Berkeley Group has done quite a bit of research on this, and so everything you see recommended here is based on best practice. It's meant to ensure fire safety, as well as limiting impacts to the natural environment. So we've proposed a minimum of a 100-foot setback from all property lines. The battery storage facility would be required to adhere to all local, state, and federal building codes and standards. And then they would also be required to have either public water to service the site or an existing commercial well and fire hydrants available to service the property. Again, this is just being sure that fire safety concerns are addressed. In addition, they would have to screen the facility and any areas within 20 feet of the facility, so in the immediate vicinity, would have to be cleared of any vegetation that's easily combustible. So they'd have to buffer the site with landscaping, but at a safe distance from the facility. We've required a decommissioning plan, similar to what you all already require for solar. And then we also have proposed a requirement that all battery storage facilities would have to create an emergency plan, and this would have to be provided to local first responders and public safety officials that would basically give them clear instructions on what to do in the event of an emergency. Are there any questions related to battery storage? Next, we have data centers, and data centers are another new use that we've proposed to add to the zoning ordinance. Data centers are becoming very popular in Virginia very quickly. The picture you see on your screen is one in Loudoun County, Virginia. And so again, it's very likely that the county could be receiving an application for one of these. And so again, wanting to make sure that the bare minimum regulations are in place, that they're cited properly, and they're not posing significant impacts to any existing residential or commercial. So data centers would only be allowed through a special use permit in the manufacturing districts. Unlike battery storage facilities, where battery storage facilities could have a commercial well, data centers would be required to connect to public water. Commercial wells would not be allowed. Data centers have quite a bit of mechanical infrastructure, and so this would have to be contained in enclosed structures and screened. So trying to prevent visual impacts from adjacent properties. It would have to be set back at least 75 feet from all property lines. And then one concern that some people have with data centers is noise. Because of the amount of mechanical equipment, sometimes there's like a humming or a buzzing noise. And so we've added a requirement that from the property line, the maximum noise level would be 65 decibels. And then we've also proposed to include a requirement for annual noise testing. Again, this is just a best practice to make sure that the noise that's being generated by a data center is not significantly impacting neighbors day and night. So this is another one that we've done quite a bit of research on. And so if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. All right, and last but certainly not least, we've got large and utility scale solar. And so we have kept everything from the existing ordinance that is currently required of large and utility scale solar facilities. So if you see that it looks different, we have kept everything that is currently required, including the new regulations that were adopted by the board earlier this spring. We have just reorganized them, and we have added some more application requirements based on best practice to ensure that an application is high quality, that it's well thought out, and that it's limiting adverse impacts on surrounding neighbors. And so again, large scale is permitted through special use permit only in A1, B1, and B2, and it is by right in M1 and M2. I know the picture is a little hard to see on the screen, but it is an example of a hospital in Virginia, and they have a large-scale solar energy facility on the property. So everything you see highlighted here would be a new requirement. So again, the facility would be required to meet with the county. They wouldn't have to go through a siting agreement because they're only large scale, they're not utility scale, but they would be required to continue submitting a site development plan and decommissioning plans. You'll see that we have added in some requirements for wildlife corridors, animal safety, allowing wildlife to pass through the property safely, providing staff with a construction schedule and a grading plan, as well as an herbicide land application plan. Again, trying to ensure that the environment is protected and considered when making an application. And then utility scale is on the next slide, and that has some additional regulations. This is only pertaining to large scale facilities. Any questions here? And then finally, we have utility scale solar. Again, everything that is currently required of utility scale solar has been retained, including the distance requirement between utility scale solar facilities and the maximum percentage of zoning district that can consist of utility scale solar. And then we've added some more new application requirements, again, to ensure that applications are high quality, they're well thought out, and that you all have as much information as possible to consider when making a decision. So everything highlighted here is new. They would be required to meet with the neighborhood, the surrounding community, prior to applying, to inform them of the project and answer any initial questions. This would be required to be publicly advertised. It can't be something that's done in secret. They have to inform the community of the meeting and provide proof to staff that they have done that. So that is in there. Again, requiring a construction schedule, requiring photo simulations and a complete visual impact analysis. We've also proposed a requirement for a community impact assessment. This would include information such as employment associated with the facility, revenue generation, and the like for staff and for you all to consider. And then we've also proposed requiring a traffic study, a grading plan, a landscaping plan, and an herbicide land application plan. Again, to be sure that the facility is considering environmental impacts, that it's buffering appropriately, and at our next work session, we'll bring you some examples of buffers, including pictures for you to look at and discuss, and that a traffic study, if you've got large construction equipment, if you have any traffic whatsoever associated with the site during operations, that information is provided in full to staff as part of the application up front. And again, these are best practices to make sure that you have rigorous and very carefully thought out applications for solar.
Emily, does this include, do we have anything about, like with the solar facility, meeting with the local fire departments? Or is that already a piece in there? You see what I'm saying? So that they can do some fire prevention or some teaching them.
We put that in our conditions, but we can add the same language that we have in the battery storage regarding the fire plan.
Yeah.
We can add that language to the solar section
I just
as well.
thought, I didn't see it in there, and I think it's a good idea for them to get connection with the local fire departments. Thank you.
That's been discussed, and some do and some don't, but I think it's imperative that we include that in the language, that these companies work closely with volunteers and make sure they're well prepared and trained.
Yep.
Sure, so adding in a requirement for all utility scale solar that would require them to provide local first responders and fire rescue with an emergency management
Yes.
plan, correct?
Yes, absolutely. It's a good idea.
So I've got, it's item L, coordination of local emergency services. The owner operator shall coordinate with Pennsylvania County Fire Marshal to provide materials, education, and/or training on how to safely respond to on-site emergencies. Emergency personnel will be given a key or code to access property in case of on-site emergency.
Yep, and be certain, wherever that goes, that the local fire departments, I know they got to contact fire marshals, so.
And then product generation of power of fire suppression plans shall be submitted and approved.
We don't want to be Canada.
That has been talked about in addition to access to the solar farms, because some of the access roads are not up to standard, which would allow for emergency vehicles to get into wherever the problem was.
We have standards in the proposed ordinance language that would address access to the facility, and then if for whatever reason the BZA decides that more access is necessary, or if that needs to be, or if regulations need to be stricter, then they can add that as a condition to the specific site.
Okay. Hey, I may have missed this, but there's a local company that takes his goats and puts them in these solar farms to eat the grass or whatever. Is there anything in here that addresses that, or is that something we need to look at? Because I don't know how many goats you're talking about.
So there's nothing in the ordinance that would preclude that from happening. So if somebody wanted to provide goats to graze, there's nothing in the ordinance that would prevent them from doing that. But there's also nothing in the ordinance that would require it either, and so that would just be part of the individual application.
Okay.
So those are all the uses and use standards that we had brought to you all for discussion tonight. Are there any additional questions related to anything that we've discussed, or do you have questions about anything that you did not see as part of this presentation?
Mr. Hunt, you got any questions?
I have one comment. Sorry if I say it.
That's fine, go ahead.
Sure.
The chairman was just reminding me, Kalen was kind enough to send us out an email that had all of the information that's from the PowerPoint in a broken down, more detailed response. We want to thank you for that, and everybody's got it, so if you want to dig in a little deeper. Did that get sent to the Planning Commission and the Board of Zoning Appeals? If not, it'd be good if we could forward that to them.
I believe we provided that,
I think it's what Richard's got, isn't it?
yes, but if we didn't, we will get that to them. I believe that's what
Richard and I came prepared.
You better shut your mouth. Good damn.
All right. Thank you. And we will see you again in August to discuss community design standards, and that will be the last one.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
more questions?
No, sir, Mr. Dalton.
All
Thank
right. Well, that's it.
you.
Meeting's adjourned. Thank